The lives of hookers are marked by a constant struggle for survival amidst exploitation and danger. Forced into a cycle of abuse, they risk life and limb for meager earnings, navigating treacherous streets, and enduring the horrors of violent clients. Their stories highlight the injustices of systemic failures and poverty, where vulnerable individuals are pushed to the fringes, making impossible choices just to make ends meet. I was a wife and a mother of a 3-year-old. Our family was really poor, but somehow we managed with our expenses. But things took a horrifying turn when one day my husband's news came home, not him. He complained about a chest pain to his fellow workers and fainted to endless sleep just a moment later, was what I was told. Almost all our little bit of savings that we had done for our baby boy's future were used in my husband's cremation ceremonies. I never had worked in past, but now I had to, for me and my little baby who had no clue what his mom was going through. After searching and getting rejected from even the smallest of jobs and running out of money, I had to take the worst decision of my life to step into the dark streets of North Carolina. Yes, I became a prostitute. It was a living hell out there as fights, abuses, drugs were very common. I got my first customer after 2 days, and that too just for $30. But I had to take that because I was in no condition to refuse any amount of money coming my way. I used to leave my son with an old friend of my husband, saying I had night shifts where I worked, and they didn't allow me to take my son there. Finally things started to get on track as I had realized this was my life, and I can only earn by this profession. I had many bad experiences with worse people in every stage of my work. Some treated me like an animal, some refused to pay me and threatened to kill me, and many more like this. But the most terrifying day of my life came 9 months after I became a sex worker. A rich-looking man who seemed to be in his late 40s offered me $1,000 for a single night. After giving it a little thought, I accepted to get in his car. While we were on the way to his house, he kept on abusing me and asked me to abuse him as well. He was driving single-handedly, and with his other hand he kept on hitting on my breasts, squeezed them with such a force that I'd scream out of terrible pain. He was getting insane every passing minute, and that made me terrified. We reached to his house, situated in the suburbans of the city. It was quite a big house with a fairly big ground in front of the house and a pool situated at the corner of the ground. He took me inside his bedroom straight away. Started undressing me like a maniac, which even resulted my dress to rip off. Then he took off his clothes and asked me to give him a BJ, on which we had agreed long time ago that it won't be a part of the deal. But he didn't listen to me, pulled my hair and made me forcefully give him a head. The whole time he was abusing me, beating me everywhere on my body, rubbing my face on his crotch with brutal force, which even made me out of breath for a moment. He forgot that beneath those stockings and tag of a prostitute, even I was a human being. Then he pushed me onto his bed, pulled out a pair of handcuffs from his briefcase, and cuffed me from one side of the bed. Suddenly he pushed himself inside me, and I felt a tremendous amount of sudden pain run through my whole body. He got into me without wearing a protection, and as I started resisting because I didn't want it to have any type of STDs from that animal, he started beating me violently, and said it's his choice as he was the one who paid. After he was finally done, and I asked him to drop me off, as my child's been waiting for me, he simply refused, saying he'll only pull out his car out of the driveway the next morning, not before that. But I couldn't stop thinking of my baby, so I had to walk almost 6 miles to home in that unbearable amount of pain. Found not even a single taxi throughout the way. I reached my home with shaking legs, torn off clothes, and a body full of cramps. It was nothing less than a nightmare. I took a bath, applied some medicines on the bleeding scratches that piece of shit made on me, thought of an excuse to make when my husband's friend would ask, seeing my condition, when I'll visit him to get my baby back. Finally that night came to an end for me, and the first thing I did next morning was to get tested for any kind of infections that could have possibly transmitted into me from that violent asshole. I quitted my life as a prostitute the same day and paid some amount of money that I had saved till now to a man who recommended me to his boss for a waiter's job in their restaurant. It's been 6 years since I've moved on from my dark past. I am living a proud and respectful life now of which I could have only dreamt of before. I'm a happy single mother now, but still whenever I think of those 9 months of my life, I couldn't hold myself from getting goosebumps. I never thought I would end up as a hooker. Growing up in a small town, I was always a good girl, raised by strict parents who instilled in me the importance of education and morality. But life has a way of turning upside down, and before I knew it, I was standing on a street corner, selling my body for money. It all started when I lost my job at a local grocery store. Being a high school dropout with no skills and a limited job market, I struggled to find another job. Bills were piling up and I was on the verge of getting evicted from my apartment. Desperate, and with no other options, I turned to an old friend who had become a successful escort. She told me about the easy money she was making and how she could introduce me to her wealthy clients. Without much thought, I jumped at the opportunity, thinking it was just a temporary solution to my financial crisis. My first few clients were not bad. They were older, wealthy men who treated me with respect and paid me well. I was slowly getting used to the idea of selling my body, putting my morals and dignity aside for the sake of survival. But then I met him, the man who would give me the worst scary experience of my life. He was different from my previous clients. Instead of the usual luxury hotel, he picked me up in his rundown car and drove to a secluded area outside the city. I felt a pang of fear, but I pushed it aside, reminding myself that I needed the money. As soon as we arrived, he led me to a dark, abandoned warehouse. I hesitated, but he assured me that it was a safe place for us to be alone. Inside, the atmosphere was eerie and ominous. I wanted to turn around and leave, but fear kept me rooted to the spot. He handed me a wad of cash and told me to undress. As I stripped down to my lingerie, he took off his clothes, revealing a body covered in tattoos. My heart started racing and the fear inside me escalated. He pushed me onto a filthy mattress on the floor and began to touch me roughly, without any regard for my comfort. The stench of alcohol on his breath made me recoil in disgust. As he forced himself on me, I screamed for him to stop, but my cries were drowned out by his grunting. Tears streamed down my cheeks as I felt violated, helpless and trapped. I don't know how long the torture lasted, but it felt like an eternity. When he was finally done, he threw some more cash at me and told me to get dressed. As I tried to leave, he pulled out a gun and pointed it at me. My heart stopped beating as I thought this was the end for me. But instead, he handed me a business card and told me to call him again for more services. I took the card, not daring to make a move as he watched me leave. I stumbled out of the warehouse, my whole body shaking with fear and disgust. But I couldn't stop. I needed to get away from that place and forget the terrifying experience I just went through. I ran until I was exhausted, my tears mixing with streaks of makeup on my face. I couldn't go back to my old life after this. The money wasn't worth the mental and physical trauma I had just endured. From that day on, I lived in constant fear. The man's face was etched in my mind, haunting me day and night. I couldn't shake off the feeling of being violated and used. I tried to find other ways to make money, but the easy cash of being a hooker had become addictive. I was trapped in that world, constantly looking over my shoulder, afraid of running into my worst nightmare. As time went by, I became more and more broken. My once upbeat personality was now replaced with emptiness and fear. I didn't trust anyone, not even myself. Every client was a potential threat, every hotel room a potential trap. I lived in a constant state of anxiety, never knowing when my worst nightmare would come back to haunt me. And it did. One day, I received a call from an unknown number. I didn't think much of it until I heard a familiar voice on the other end. It was him, the man who had violated me in the warehouse. Panic set in as he told me that he had been watching me and he wanted me to meet him again. My heart raced as I tried to find an excuse, but he didn't give me a chance to speak. He threatened to come after me and hurt me if I didn't meet him. I was paralyzed with fear. I had never felt so helpless. I couldn't go to the police. I was a hooker after all. I couldn't tell my family or friends. They would be disgusted, and I would be judged. I was alone and vulnerable. On the day of the meeting, I forced myself to go. I didn't want to, but I couldn't risk my life. He had told me to meet him at the same warehouse, the place that held so many painful memories. As I stepped inside, my body started shaking. But instead of the monster I expected to see, there was a group of people waiting for me. Surrounded by strangers, I felt exposed and vulnerable. But then, they handed me a letter, written by the man who had tortured me. In it, he apologized for his actions and asked for forgiveness. He explained that he was a troubled man who had taken out his pain on others. He had seen the error of his ways and wanted to make amends. As I read the words, tears streamed down my face. I couldn't believe what I was reading. I was so consumed by my own pain and fear that I never stopped to think that the man behind it all was also struggling with his own demons. I had judged him without knowing his story. And in that moment, forgiveness washed over me. I forgave him for what he had done to me, and I released the fear and pain that had been consuming me. Since that day, I have stopped being a hooker. I now work in a cafe, surrounded by good people who accept me for who I am, without knowing my past. Every day is still a struggle, but I am slowly healing and learning to let go of the pain. And as for the man who gave me the worst scary experience of my life, I hope he has found peace and redemption. I may never forget what happened, but I have learned to forgive and move on. It was a dark and stormy night, the kind that sent shivers down your spine and made you question every decision you've ever made. For me, it was just another night working as a hooker on the streets of the city, hoping to make some quick cash to pay off my debts and escape this grim life. I walked down the dimly lit alley, my long coat shielding me from the pouring rain. The sounds of thunder echoed through the deserted streets, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I clutched my bag tight, trying to ignore the feeling of unease that was growing inside me. But as I made my way towards my usual spot, something caught my attention in the corner of my eye. A figure, dressed in all black, was following me. I quickened my pace, my heart racing with fear. I knew the dangers of my line of work, but I never thought I would encounter something like this. Suddenly, I felt a sharp blow to the back of my head and everything went black. When I came to, I was lying in a dark room, my hands and feet bound with rope. My head was throbbing, and I could taste blood in my mouth. I tried to scream for help, but a cloth was shoved into my mouth, muffling any sound. Panic set in as I realized the gravity of the situation. I was kidnapped and held captive by a twisted individual. My captor finally revealed himself, a man with a sinister grin and a glint of madness in his eyes. He introduced himself as Victor and told me his sick intentions. He was going to torture me and take his time enjoying my pain, before finally ending my life. I was just another one of his victims, caught in his sick game. He took out a knife and began tracing it along my skin, leaving a trail of blood in his wake. I could do nothing but lay there, helpless and terrified as he relished in my fear. Each cut felt like a million knives stabbing me, and I could feel my life slowly ebbing away. But just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, my captor suddenly slit his own wrist and smeared his blood on my face. He licked the blood off his fingers and whispered in my ear, "We are blood brothers now. Your pain is mine and mine is yours." I was paralyzed with fear and disgust. This man was not just a madman, he was a cannibal. I knew it was only a matter of time before he would devour me. Days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months. I was trapped in this hell, with my twisted captor constantly finding new ways to torture me. He would cut off pieces of my flesh and force me to eat them, laughing maniacally as I gagged and vomited. Each passing day brought more horror and pain. I longed for death, but it seemed to elude me at every turn. I was nothing but a shell of my former self, my body covered in scars and my mind broken from trauma. But then, one night, I saw my chance for escape. Victor had left the door unlocked, and I knew I had to take the risk. In one swift move, I untied my binds and ran out into the unknown. I could feel the rain on my skin, the cool drops a welcome relief from the constant torture. But as I ran through the streets, I realized that I didn't know where I was and I had no one to turn to. All I could do was keep running, praying that I would stumble upon someone who could help me. But just as I thought I was safe, I felt a sharp pain in my back. I stumbled and fell to the ground, my vision fading in and out. I looked up and saw the twisted face of my captor, his knife dripping with blood. He had caught up to me and now he was going to finish what he started. But fate was on my side that night. A group of police officers had been on patrol and they heard my screams. They quickly apprehended Victor and saved me from the clutches of death. I was rushed to the hospital, my body broken and battered. But as I lay in that hospital bed, I knew that the physical wounds were nothing compared to the emotional scars that would never heal. I was damaged beyond repair, a mere shell of a human being. In the months that followed, I struggled to come to terms with what had happened to me. I couldn't erase the memories of the horrors I had endured. And as I looked for a way to move on, I couldn't help but wonder, was all of this worth the few dollars I had earned as a hooker on the dangerous streets of the city?